So when we're troubleshooting our operating systems, we have to remember that the operating system serves as the heart of the computer. If our operating system stops working, so does the productivity of the workstation and the users that use it. So for us, that's usually going to be Windows, right? If Windows crashes, your user is going to lose their data and they're not going to be able to do their work. So it's imperative that we understand the common symptoms that we have with the operating system's problems and the tools that we're going to use to fix it. The first thing you're going to notice with Windows is the famous blue screen of death. If you've been using Windows for any length of time, you've probably seen this before. This occurs during startup or during normal system operations, and it's called the BSOD, or a stop error. The reason it's called a stop error is because of that blue arrow on the screen there. You get this code that says stop, and it gives you a code. If you look up that code, it'll tell you why the operating system stopped and what you might be able to do about it. Okay? It also will sometimes do a memory dump, as you can see here at the bottom of the screen, and that can be used by forensic analysis to figure out why the computer has errored out. Often the cause of blue screens of death is going to be a memory issue, so your memory chips could be going bad, or you have some kind of a really nasty malware infection. Those are usually the two things I see with blue screens of death. Next thing we're going to talk about is a failure to boot. If you try to boot up the operating system and you get a boot failure, or boot media not found, something like that, that can cause you not to be able to boot up the computer. If you can't boot the computer, you can't get to the operating system, you can't get into the software to be able to do your work. So this can be caused by incorrect configurations in the BIOS, such as if you went into manually configured hard drive settings like sectors and boot reads. You can have corrupted or missing boot files that would need to be corrected, or even missing drivers that are causing it to crash on boot. We're going to play with some boot errors later. We'll talk more about the ones specific to Windows, such as the NT loader error and the boot manager missing error. And we'll talk about those later in the lecture. Improper shutdown. You can get this error if the startup, it's caused by startup programs and services that prevent Windows from properly shutting down. If you look here, you'll see that you'll usually reboot and you'll get something that looks like this on the screen that'll say Windows had failed to start, you had a recent issue. Would you like to try to repair it, or would you like to try to restart Windows normally? Generally, you'll try to do the startup repair. Windows will try to fix the problem itself. If it can't, then you can start up Windows normally and see if it will load, and if it does, you can then try to fix the problems that way. The next one we have is spontaneous shutdown or reboot. This is often caused by a configuration to automatically restart upon a stop or a blue screen of death error that occurs. So in System Properties, underneath the Advanced Settings, you can go to the Startup and Recovery. And when you do that, you'll have the option of automatically restarting when there's a system failure, as you can see in the right panel there. And you'll see where the memory dump is located, so that if you're trying to do forensic analysis of it, you know where to grab that memory dump from. You're really getting in the weeds if you're trying to look through memory dump files to figure out what caused it. Okay? But generally, this box is not normally checked. If you get a stop error, you want it to stop and freeze on that blue screen so you can figure out what the error was, right? If you automatically restart, it'll crash and then automatically reboot and try to restart the computer and go about its business, which is fine to get the user back up and running quickly, but if it keeps doing this all the time, they're never going to get to the point where they call you to fix the problem. So this is a setting you have to decide whether or not you want on. Generally, I leave the automatically restart off. I like to leave it so that it does crash, goes to the blue screen, the user will then call me to come fix it. Next one is the RAID not detected during installation. We saw this ourselves in our lab when we tried to install Windows 7 the other day. We were using the hardware RAID controller and we didn't have the proper drivers for it, so Windows 7 wouldn't recognize it. Often the cause is just you don't have the drivers and Windows doesn't understand it by default. So to fix this, we would go and find those drivers, we would sideload them into the Windows installation, and then the RAID would end up being picked up. Next we have our device fails to start. Sometimes when you install a device, you update the drivers, you try to start the device, and it won't start for some reason. You'll usually see this in the device manager with the error icon, that red exclamation mark, or the yellow question mark, right? And this will happen after you install a new device or driver. The best thing to do is update the drivers to make sure the hardware will actually understand how to talk with Windows. And if you update the drivers, it should start working again. If it doesn't, it could be that your device itself is defective. So if this is a USB Wi-Fi card, for instance, it may be time to buy a new one. If it's an internal card, like a video card or a sound card, it may be time to replace that card as well. It may have been damaged during installation. Missing DLL files. So DLLs stand for Dynamic Link Library. It's a binary file that's used by the operating system or another program. Basically, it's a file that tells that coders can actually use when they're programming to reference these DLLs that are created by Microsoft. And it allows them not to have to recode features that are already provided by the OS. Okay? If a DLL is referenced by a program and that DLL doesn't exist in the operating system, that can cause your application to fail. This can happen because the DLL was deleted by accident or it was deleted maliciously through a virus or malware. Okay? Here's an example of it. The application failed to start because my tillis.dll was not found. Somebody probably went in there and deleted that file. That's not a standard Microsoft file that's there. So they probably need to uninstall and reinstall this application to reinstall that DLL. Okay? This will allow you to overcome this error. Services that fail to start. So you're trying to start a service. We talked about services. They're these background programs in the operating system that provide us different features such as printing and wireless connectivity, synchronization, and more. If it fails to start, it could be that that service is corrupted or that somebody doesn't have the proper permissions to start that service. Some services have to be started as admin. Here's an example of a Garmin, one of the smart devices, the fitness trackers, and it's not working properly because the person who's trying to install it is not an admin. They're just a standard user. And if they were an admin, they would have proper permissions and they could start the service. So it's just one of those things you can do. If the service fails to start, that program's not running, and so in this case, that Garmin device isn't going to be able to connect to that Windows machine. Compatibility error. So if you're using an older program on a newer operating system, you can run into a compatibility error. This is the error that's received when you're using an older program on a newer version of Windows. So if I have like my old Doom game that was designed for Windows 95 and I'm trying to run it on Windows 7, I may get a compatibility error. In that case, I would probably want to run it in compatibility mode, like we talked about back in features, to be able to run it as if I was running it in Windows 95. This becomes more of an issue not so much with software as it does with drivers, though. So if I have a printer that was, that I've had in my closet for 10 years, and I'm trying to use it with Windows 7, even though it was designed for Windows XP, the driver doesn't exist, and so the compatibility error can happen. That's what's ending up happening in this screen here. You can see the driver was blocked due to compatibility issues. It's an older device that somebody's trying to use on a newer system. Slow system performance. Sometimes your system starts running slower than normal. This can be an indication of many things. It could be malicious, that there's malware running on your system. It could be that you don't have the system configured properly for maximum performance. It could be that you're using this page file, that virtual memory we talked about before, and it's becoming full or fragmented, making access times to the hard drive take even longer. It could be you need to add more memory, or it could be that your system is overheating, because a lot of systems, if they start overheating, it'll start slowing down the processor to compensate and try to cool down. Because if you run the processor slower, it will run cooler. So in this case, you can see that the processing power here is pegging high at 100% over and over and over again. So maybe this is time for us to get a new processor and upgrade because we're pegging it high consistently. If we look at the memory and it was pegged high consistently, we put in more RAM, right? If we're pegging high on the hard drive, we might want to upgrade that hard drive to a solid state drive or one of those 10,000 or 15,000 RPM hard drives or a hybrid drive, something that will help increase the performance. This is one of those things you guys start looking around and go, where is the bottleneck in the system? And then start addressing those bottlenecks. Booting to safe mode. So when you boot up the computer, you can boot to safe mode. Safe mode is used when the computer doesn't shut down properly. When you boot in safe mode, what you end up doing is booting up into Windows with a minimal operating system with the least amount of drivers, and it's going to look ugly. But if every time you start up the computer, it keeps crashing, it may be a driver that's causing it to crash. Booting into safe mode will allow you to get into Windows to eliminate that driver and replace it. So safe mode can be very useful from a diagnostic and troubleshooting standpoint. Files that fail to open. Sometimes you'll get a file corruption that won't let you open it, such as this up here. Sometimes it's a broken file association. So when you try double-clicking the file, it goes, I don't know how to open that type of file. For instance, if you have an XLS file that's normally opened by Excel, right? Or a DOC file is normally opened by Word. If that file association is broken and every time you double-click the file it won't open, you'll have to reassociate that file. Or you open up Word first and then go File, Open, and open that file. If that's the case, the file is good, it's just the association that's broken. If the file is corrupted, you're going to have to restore it from backup because that file is not going to be recoverable. Okay? NT loader. This is an issue for Windows XP only. Basically, if you see the NT loader is missing, which you're seeing on the right, this is the issue. You'd end up booting from the recovery CD, the Windows XP installation disk. You'll boot into what's called the recovery console. When you get to the main screen, you hit R, it brings you into the recovery console. And the way to solve this problem is to copy the NT loader file from the CD back to the hard drive. And to do that, you type in the command copy d:/i386/NT loader, which is where it's loaded on the CD. It's in the i386 folder, to C drive. If it already exists, it'll ask you if you want to overwrite it. If it's missing, it's probably not going to exist, and you just hit yes. Once you do that, you reboot the machine, and it will boot just fine. In the lab, I'll set up a machine like that for you guys. You guys can test on that, okay? And you guys can play with that. Used to be one of the simulations that was common in CompTIA, but now as XP is no longer really supported by Microsoft, they've moved away from using the NT loader example, and they use the one that we use on Windows 7, which is called Boot Manager, which is a very similar process. Missing Boot.ini. So there's a file on your hard drive in the C drive called the Boot.ini file, and it allows you to display the boot options when you start up the computer by using the NT loader program in Windows XP. And again, if you open up that Boot.ini file, this is what it looks like. You can see here there's a timeout of 30, and in this case we only have one drive, one disk, disk 0, one partition, disk 1, with Windows in it. And one operating system. If we were dual booting and we had Windows XP and Windows 7 or Windows XP and Linux, you might see multiple ones listed here. If you're not seeing the operating system you want, it could be a corrupted Boot.ini file. If the Boot.ini file is missing, it won't know where to boot the operating system from. So this can be another issue for you, and you'd have to recreate this file. Missing operating system. We saw this the other day in our labs as well. We booted the computer and we didn't have anything installed to the hard drives yet because we just put in brand new hard drives. This gives you the missing operating system showing. So in this case, what you'd have to do is put in a new master boot record or install an operating system. If you already had an operating system and this comes up, somebody has corrupted your hard drive. You can try repairing the master boot record and it'll bring the operating system back for you. If not, you may have to fully reinstall and reload all of the software and drivers and data. Missing GUI or the GUI fails to load. So the GUI is the graphical user interface. So when you try to boot up Windows, if it doesn't boot to the familiar desktop, that's what we're talking about, is a failure to load the GUI. If the GUI is missing, it will boot to the command prompt only mode. You would just reboot Windows to connect. Once you reboot, it'll go ahead and reboot itself back to the GUI. If instead you get an error saying the GUI fails to load, it could be an issue with the way your monitor is set up. Your refresh settings could be wrong. You might want to go ahead and reboot to VGA mode. In there you can change it back to a basic setting, reboot Windows, get into the environment, and then reset your graphics card that way. This is not a very common issue for people, but if it does, it kind of freaks people out. It's like, oh no, I don't see my Windows desktop. It's a fairly easy solution to get by. Invalid boot disk. So invalid boot disk is a very common one. It was even more common back in the days of floppy. Because floppy drives were always checked first. So what would happen is, especially in school environments, students would put in their floppy disk, save the reports to the floppy disk, right? You'd reboot the computer and forget that you had that data disk sitting in the floppy drive. The computer tries to boot from the floppy disk. It goes, this is a non-system disk. I don't know how to boot it. And you get this error. The way to solve it was remove the disk and hit the space bar, and it would go ahead and reboot from the hard drive. It wasn't a big issue. The boot disk didn't have a valid operating system on it. If you have no disks in the drive and it's just your hard drive and this is coming up, it means your hard drive doesn't have an operating system. And so it's time to install an operating system. Okay? If you already had Windows on there, you should not see this error. This is usually if you got a brand new hard drive you haven't installed anything to yet. So some tools we can use. We have what's called the pre-installation environment, also known as PE. The pre-installation environment is a set of tools that can be booted and loaded from a CD, DVD, or thumb drive. This particular picture comes from the Windows 7 installation disk. When you boot to Windows 7, you can either click on the install button or the recovery mode, When you go to recovery tools, this is what will show up. You'll have system restore functionality, system image recovery, Windows diagnostic for memory, and command prompt, so we can do commands if needed. So this is a very useful tool set that we can use. In the old XP days, we had the automated system recovery, which again came on the Windows installation disk. When you booted up, you would hit the R command once you got to the first menu, and it would allow you to get in here. From here, you can actually configure user accounts, do hard disk configurations, network configurations, video settings, hardware settings, software settings, and operating boot files. Again, this is an old XP thing, not real relevant to today's computers. Nowadays, we really do use the recovery tool sets that we have in Windows 7. So in Windows 7, we have these graphical and text-based tool sets to fix common startup issues. And again, we just talked about this. We have startup, system, system recovery, memory diagnostics, and command prompt. We'll talk about those more later as well, and we'll play with those in our lab environment. So, FIXMBR. Again, your hard drive has what's called a master boot record. That's where it tells it how the hard drive is accessed. If the master boot record is missing or corrupted, you'll have to use the FIXMBR command to correct it. You can do this from the Windows Recovery Console in XP. When we get into Windows 7 computers, we have a newer tool than this that we're going to use. And it's called FIXBOOT, or BOOTREC, which is for boot record. So, in our case, we would go into the Windows Recovery Console, which I showed you before with Windows 7. We would click the bottommost button, which is the command prompt, which would bring us here. And then we're going to type BOOTREC /FIXBOOT, as you can see on the screen. By doing that, it's going to correct the boot manager, which is that master boot record that is missing or corrupted for Windows Vista or Windows 7. This tends to come up as a simulation, okay, where you'll have to go pick the boot from the DVD, go into the command prompt, type this command from memory, and hit enter. It'll tell you it's completed successfully, and you now have solved the simulation. So keep this in mind. We'll go over this again as we practice for simulations, but this is one of the ones that you want to keep in mind. Safe mode, we talked about before. It's used when Windows can't start and there are no error messages provided. So instead, it will actually start up with a minimal set of drivers and programs. You can set it from the boot menu, from safe mode, and when you get into safe mode, notice how it's not very pretty looking, right? It's a minimalist display. Your background is gone. You've got this black background. The corners all say safe mode to let you know you're in safe mode. And then you can go through and start fixing problems that you have using safe mode. It's a way to get back into Windows when everything else is not really working well for you. It allows the technician to get in there and start doing things like remove bad drivers, right? Remove affecting programs. Command prompt. We've talked about command prompt before. The command prompt or command shell, command line interface, all the same thing. We use it to run text-based programs and file functions in Windows. And again, during our lab time, we'll play with the command prompt, get you guys familiar with it. SFC is the System File Checker. You run this from the command prompt. You type in SFC/scan now, and it will scan your files. It'll check all the protected system files from Windows, and if any of them are invalid or missing, it will correct them by copying over good copies. So if you have an older machine, I think, Dave, you were talking about yesterday, you had a system that was not working right with the zip, when you're trying to zip things, I would try running SFC/scan now, and then see if it'll work. Because it may be that the program that's running the compression inside Windows has been corrupted, and this will fix that. DEFRAG. DEFRAG is a tool we talked about back in disk management. It assists Windows in regaining lost read and write performance by taking that fragmentation of the drive and making it contiguous again, right? And again, by doing it, you can do DEFRAG and then the drive letter, like we have here, DEFRAG E, and you can see it analyzes it first. It finds out how fragmented it really is. In this case, it was 0% fragmented, so it really didn't need to be done. And if it was more than 10%, we would want to run the full DEFRAG, and it will shuffle all the pieces of data on the hard drive to put them in the right order for fastest performance. regserve32. It is a command line tool that registers DLL files as command components in the registry. So if you get that missing DLL, you may need to go ahead and relink them, and doing it through here, like here, regserve32, winmtextdll, it'll actually go ahead and register that particular DLL. In this case, they were unregistering it by doing the tag U. If you have a bad DLL or a corrupt DLL or a malware-based DLL, you can do that with the tag U and get rid of it that way as well. Unload it from the system, or if you just have the name of it, it will load it into the system. So it can be a very helpful thing when you're doing malware recovery. REGEDIT, we talked about REGEDIT before. It is the registry. Everything in Windows goes back into the registry. REGEDIT is a way for us to view and edit the registry of Windows. Normally, you're not going to need to view or edit the registry. Sometimes there are certain settings you can only get to through the registry, though. Again, the warning I said before, if you're going to use REGEDIT, make sure you know what you're doing with it. There are entire classes and textbooks based on going through the Windows registry. It is very complex, very in-depth topic when you start digging into it. Repair disks. So in Windows, we can create a repair disk in Windows 7 or Windows Vista from the Windows Recovery Console. By creating this disk, it allows us to have a disk that we can boot from, and then we can get into command prompt or the system recovery tools, that pre-execution environment we were talking about, and be able to restore our computer or fix serious errors. MSCONFIG, we talked about that yesterday. We had a whole lecture on it. MSCONFIG is a utility that enables the user to disable programs and services that are running at startup to prevent boot issues. So if every time the computer boots, you check the logs and it says, hey, every time I start iTunes, the computer crashes, maybe we want to go in here and tell it not to start iTunes every time the computer starts, because it's crashing the computer. We can do that through the Startup tab under MSCONFIG. Event Viewer. Event Viewer, we can get to that through the computer management, or we can go directly to the Event Viewer itself. In the Event Viewer, you're going to have the application, security, system, setup, and forwarded events logs. When you click on a particular log, like the application log, you'll see all the logs based on time and the source. You can click on it and get more details in the bottom panel. This can be helpful if the computer keeps crashing every morning at 3:02 a.m. and you don't know why. Go into the event log, see what's happening at 3:02 in the morning. Maybe at 3:02 in the morning is when your backup kicks off, and your backup file has gotten corrupted, and so it keeps crashing the computer, right? Just an example. It's a way to track down what's going on. All of these are divided into error messages, warnings, or informational. In this particular screen, you're seeing all the informational ones. So a sample question for you. Which of the following commands may need to be run after a virus removal if the computer will not boot? ScanDisk, DXDiag, FIXMBR, or MSCONFIG? What do you guys think? So in this case, it's going to be FIXMBR. Some viruses will attack your master boot record, and so if you had something that was dug in that deep, it can corrupt your master boot record. So you'll boot from your Windows CD, go into that command prompt, run FIXMBR, which is again, that's an XP thing, right? For our newer systems, we use BOOTREC/FIXBOOT on Windows 7 or Windows Vista, and it would fix that.